we've also got this exclusive report. Steve, it exposes what teachers at public schools are really thinking about Jews. I mean, you might be shocked to hear this, but you might not, given the level of anti-Israel activism we've seen in the classroom. And you have to ask, what are these people teaching our kids if this is what they're saying about Jews? We've got that report coming up. Also, you remember the Greens politician who claimed Jews have their tentacles in everything, and well, even the Prime Minister criticised those remarks. And yet, why has she now been invited to a public school as the guest of honour? I've got those details in just a minute. Also, new revelations. This is breaking news. It's out tonight that Anthony Albanese was warned against the Voice referendum, but he ignored that advice and went ahead anyway. Insiders have spoken out to dish the dirt on what went on behind the scenes. That breaking news story coming up. And also tonight, we'll look at how the polls seem to be getting worse and worse for the Prime Minister. And after Albanese's weekend of celebrity concerts and taxpayer-funded jets, well, the timing couldn't be worse. But first tonight, the anti-Semitic Greens politician who claimed that Jews have their tentacles everywhere, you remember that comment just a couple of weeks ago, well, she's now been celebrated as the guest of honour at a public school. Jenny Leong was criticised by Albanese just a few weeks ago for these remarks.
The Jewish lobby and the Zionist lobby are infiltrating into every single aspect of what is ethnic community groups. They rock up and they're part of the campaign. They offer support for things like the campaign against the 18C racial vilification laws. They offer solidarity. They rock up to every community event and meeting to offer that connection because their tentacles reach in to the areas that try and influence power. And I think that we need to call that out and expose it.
I mean, those comments were so bad that even the Labor politician Josh Burns, he called it one of the most blatantly racist and bigoted things that any politician had ever uttered in the country. And Liberal MP Julian Leese expressed his outrage. Both the Prime Minister and Dutton said the comments were despicable. And it was only after all of this criticism that Jenny Leong eventually apologised.
The comments by my local member, the member for Newtown, whose comments about tentacles with regard to the Jewish community, I find offensive. I find it had its origins in anti-Semitism, and I condemn it unequivocally.
Not one Greens MP, state or federal, has called out and publicly rebuked Ms Leong. Not one. Not one. They all have remained silent. Right now, Jewish people in Australia don't feel safe and respected by the Greens.
To the members of the Greens I say, I don't have tentacles. Neither does my 5-year-old son or my 2-year-old daughter. Neither does my friend the member for McNamara or the member for Isaacs or the member for Macarthur, and neither do the patriotic Jewish Australians who contribute to the country they love.
And yet, a New South Wales public school has invited Jenny Leong to be their guest of honour just on Friday. Some in the audience were shocked to see this anti-Semitic politician walk out to present high-achieving students with awards at the Fort Street High School Speech Day. She handed out the Year 7 prizes. This was all held at Sydney's Town Hall. There were several hundred parents there just on Friday. There were also staff and students, and even those who weren't Jewish, I'm told, were troubled by the school inviting Leong, this anti-Semitic politician, to present the awards. You can see the photographs that someone who was there has sent me. The Education Department's Marrickville Network Principals Director was also there. You wonder what the Education Department has to say about this. Now, elder political statesman, former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer, says that he used to think the Greens were little more than a well-meaning but wacky environmentalist party. But he says he's now realised that the Greens are ominous. He says they're extremist ideologues who embrace anti-Semitism. And he wrote an article in The Fin where he referenced Jenny Leong's remarks, and he said that never has a political party so racist, confrontational and divisive been elected to the Australian Parliament. He says what the Greens have done is give legitimacy to anti-Semitism. We've already reported that Fort Street High School has had problems with extensive pro-Palestinian activism over the past few months. They've had posters plastered around the campus. They've had teachers arguing that they should be able to wear the keffiyeh, that's the Palestinian black and white checkered scarf, to school. But Jenny Leong being invited to present awards just 3 weeks after those horrific and offensive comments sends a message to students that, unlike other forms of racism, racism against Jews is somehow to be tolerated. This is a dangerous message to send, that anti-Semitism should be condoned and is acceptable. And this is precisely one of the findings of a new report that's coming out tomorrow on anti-Semitism in Australian schools. These are schools across the country, by the way. I've been given an advanced copy to share with you tonight. Now, it found that some school communities and leaders are apparently unwilling to treat anti-Semitic behaviour with the same level of concern as other forms of discrimination. We all know that's true. This report includes, it's a YouGov survey of about 510 public school teachers, and it found that 24% had either witnessed, knew about, or had direct experience of anti-Semitism. And the report concludes that incidents of racism and anti-Semitism remain concerningly pervasive among the student population. The report says that the data suggests that there are roughly 75,000 anti-Semitic incidents in public schools across Australia each year. I mean, that seems like a stunning number. It's hard to believe that's even true. One teacher said that they suffered consequences after they reported anti-Semitism. And the teacher was quoted in this report saying, "I have learnt to keep my head down and mouth shut or risk losing my job." Now, public school teachers are partly to blame, with the report finding that the factors that cause this racism include apathy towards anti-Semitism among some members of the teaching workforce, also poor teaching approaches when it comes to teaching the Holocaust. There's a lot of conflating of the political with the personal, and the influence of social media in spreading and normalising anti-Semitic content. The report also discusses what it calls the new anti-Semitism, where the politicisation of the Israel-Hamas war means that criticism of Israel has morphed into irrational hatred of Jews. Now, the Blueprint Institute, which did this report, found that Australian students are experiencing vilification and physical aggression rationalised by disdain for the actions of a foreign government. Proving this very point was the response of one teacher who said, and I quote, "If the Israelis stopped treating neighbouring countries and their people so bad, people might not hate them so much." Gotta hope that teacher isn't an English teacher. Now, the report calls for more leadership from the federal government, and the CEO of the Blueprint Institute is going to be on the show a bit later. But surely, at the most basic level, and we don't need a report to tell us this, if you're trying to encourage a successful multicultural society for our next generation of children, if the education department doesn't want to have racial division in the classroom and at schools, then surely they wouldn't invite a Greens politician guilty of blatantly offensive and a racist remark into a public school to hand out prizes just a few weeks after she accused Jews of spreading our tentacles everywhere. Children are impressionable. They're vulnerable to influence. And I have to tell you, Jenny Leong's influence is toxic. All right, joining me as always on a Monday night, our terrific panel, Sky News hosts and contributor Liz Storer and Joe Hildebrand.
Hello, how are you, Sharri?
Both?
Great to
Liz, very quickly before we get on to the other topics, what do you think about this, the school inviting Jenny Leong into hand out prizes to Year 7 students.
Well, is it any surprise? It was in Victoria also that we saw the unions get involved with the massive school walkouts. That's when the horse really bolted in terms of government had an opportunity to say, we are not okay with this kind of activism in our schools. And now a school thinks it's perfectly appropriate to invite someone like her, who has spouted on several occasions outright Jew hatred, to present at a ceremony
a speech
attended by hundreds of students and parents. But what this really speaks to is the idiocy of collective guilt, because even if those here in Australia, including Jenny Leong, actually believe that the Israeli government is some sort of genocidal death cult, that has nothing to do with everyday Jewish people
100%.
living here in Australia, just trying to go about their daily business and live peaceful lives.
Not to mention students in schools.
It's worth noting that Fort Street also isn't just any old public high school. It's an elite public high school. It's a selective school. It's regarded as the sort of very pinnacle of educational success. So if the pinnacle of educational success is getting a tap on the shoulder from someone who thinks that Jews are octopuses who, you know, spread their tentacles throughout society, which is straight out of the sort of Nazi ideological and image playbook, God help us all.
Yeah, it's the international Jewish conspiracy just being spouted to
the elders of the Protocols of Zion. She must have looked it up on the internet.
Unbelievable.
All right, let's move on to the breaking news tonight. This is an inside story in The Nightly, a new digital website, new digital newspaper. It reveals that even Labor insiders were surprised that Anthony Albanese made the Voice referendum a first-term priority on election night. This story by the former editor-in-chief of The Australian, Christopher Daw, says that Anthony Albanese stunned Labor colleagues by ignoring explicit advice warning against declaring the Voice referendum a first-term priority on election night, and has been cursed by the call ever since. The Nightly can reveal Indigenous Affairs Minister Linda Burney was even worried during the 2022 election campaign about the likelihood of a Voice referendum being rejected if Labor couldn't get bipartisan support. Joe Hildebrand, does this align with what you've heard, that Labor insiders were shocked to hear the Prime Minister in his election night speech commit to the Voice referendum?
Yeah, I have to say it certainly does. My jaw hit the floor when I saw it. I remember that moment with just crystal clear clarity, despite being a few beers in on election night, very late. And I just thought, oh my God, where did this come from? This simply wasn't on the agenda. It was nothing that I'd heard in all my talks with various people high up. I can understand why he said it and why he felt the need to say it, because he'd run a small target strategy. Suddenly he's got, you know, hundreds of the cheering faithful going elbow elbow at the Canterbury Hurlstone Park RSL club, and you want to be able to say, this is what I'm going to do. And
to
suddenly
get even
all
more
that
cheers.
that's right. And suddenly, well, that's right. You should never go for likes and you should never go for cheers. But I guess suddenly all that discipline throughout the campaign that got Albo elected just disappeared in the sort of hot-bloodedness of the moment. So I can completely
had too many sherbets.
I can completely understand it, but it was the first and arguably the biggest of many errors throughout the campaign. And again, you know, there are plenty of people who should take a slice of that cake. There's plenty of blame to go around. But yeah, it was a huge shock to me and to virtually everyone I know in the Labor Party. There are reports that one or two people knew on the night, maybe shortly before he said it. But I'm not even sure if that's true. Certainly, you know, I mean, I know, without sounding like a wanker, I tend to know most things that are going to happen, and it was just a...
Oh, well, Joe, where are the stories? If you know everything that's going to happen.
No, that's right. Tomorrow...
Stop holding out on us.
On your mobile phone favourites, speed dial.
Well, yeah, it's not so much that, but I've sort of got a vibe for... hasn't the vibe been serving...
I thought you didn't want to sound like a wanker, Joe.
No, that's right. But you get a sense like that it was so jarring because it was against every single theme, every single message, every single priority of the campaign. It was something that had barely been spoken of at all during the campaign.
And if his nearest and dearest...
So, and then suddenly it's like number one, first thing we're going to do.
It's not only that they didn't know about it, but this piece by Christopher Doyle reveals that actually he ignored the advice of many senior people in Labor not to move ahead with the voice, and he went ahead anyway. What does that tell you about the Prime Minister's ability to accept advice?
I tell you what, he must be very, very sorry he didn't take it now. But the kind of confidence that it takes, and given that his nearest and dearest were blindsided on the night, so were the Australian people. This isn't something that he'd campaigned on all that heavily. This isn't something the Australian people had gone to the ballot box going, yeah, actually, I want a Prime Minister who's going to talk about nothing but this for the first 18 months of his term while we're in a cost of living crisis, while we've got, so much unrest going on in the world. We've got China breathing down our necks. Yeah, this is the guy that I want to vote for. But the kind of confidence it takes, talk about poor judgment. This is poor judgment on steroids. We know that only 8 out of 45 referendums in this country have ever got up. And here's this brand new Prime Minister, not even 24 years old, going, yep, first term election promise, I have nothing else to say, so this is what I'm going to throw out there.
It was a genuine thing. I don't think it was a cynical manoeuvre. I think he does have a lot of confidence. I think it was something he genuinely wanted to do. And again, let's not forget that over 60% of Australians were backing the voice until the campaign started.
If it's something that he genuinely wanted to do, all he had to do was drop the constitutional change part.
Or he should have just told people about it during the election. Let's move on, though.
Honesty.
The PM did have a busy weekend, at least on the social front. As you probably know by now, he spent Friday night in Sydney with his fiancée and adult son, shaking it off to Taylor Swift. Then on Melbourne, he attended a private concert by Katy Perry at Anthony Pratt's mansion. Look, the PM's been criticised on social media for all of this, Joe. There have been comments like Australians are suffering price increases in supermarkets, energy, and the PM's on vacation. Someone else is saying most of us couldn't afford a ticket to Taylor Swift, and meanwhile other people would have loved to have gone but couldn't get tickets for their children. The PM's defended the fact that he went to both of those functions, but is this the best look? And fair enough, he goes to a concert, but it's the Dunkley by-election on Saturday, so do you think that that probably wasn't the best time?
I can understand why a lot of people on the right would be furious at the hypocrisy of the entire Twitterati left pouring onto Scott Morrison, saying how outrageous it was that he took a Christmas holiday with his family while there were bushfires in Australia. I was not one of those people who jumped on that bandwagon, and I said then, and I therefore have a clean slate to say now, that we want our politicians, and especially our political leaders, our prime ministers, to be normal people. We want them to have holidays so they don't go insane. We want them to have family lives. We want them to have love lives. We want them to be able to pop the question to the woman they love. We want them to be able to have a break. Yes, when there are big major events in Australia, the Australian Prime Minister is going to be invited to them, and sometimes he is going to go. So yes, you will see him at the Australian Open final. You will see him at Taylor Swift. You will see him at the grand final, I'm sure. And if there's the South Sydney Rabbitohs games that he hasn't been at, I'm yet to find a bet. But the point is, you want that. That doesn't mean that he's not working all the time on other things. And if you say, well, you're not allowed to do anything that's not, 24/7 work when anything bad is happening anywhere, then you're just never going to get anyone. And it will send you insane. I mean, who probably worked more hours than any other Prime Minister in the last 20 years was Kevin Rudd. Look how that turned out.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Meanwhile, former PM Scott Morrison, Liz, also went and he posted a video on Insta of him boogieing along to Taylor Swift. I think we've got that video coming up.
Oh, God, no.
There you go.
Of course, he's been defended for this, though, saying, well, he's got 2 young daughters, so of course he's a Swiftie. Of course he would have taken the opportunity to take them along, whereas Albo's just got a teenage son, so how dare he?
His son's in his 20s, I think. He's not a teenage anymore.
Oh, there you go. Okay, he's a bit older than I thought. But
I'm surprised Nathan was caught on camera. I would have been.
Taylor Swift as well.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. But the irony of of the position that Albo finds himself in now, he would have gone along to the concert being like, yeah, look, I'm a man of the people. I love Taylor Swift too. That's backfired spectacularly, which I do think is unfair, given 608,000 Aussies have attended Taylor Swift concerts over her tour this year. So how on earth does that make you like, I couldn't get along, therefore how dare you? As for the partying with millionaires, to anyone surprised by that, I'd say I am so sorry it has taken this long for any illusion that those elites in power in our country don't do that kind of thing from time to time. Some consider it part of the job.
Now, let's look at this new recycling tax. This was an exclusive in The Australian. Reports, Joe, that it's on the cards, with recyclables exporters warning that the new regulations would come in soon and force them to pass on millions in extra costs to consumers. Is this...
Yeah, there's a bit of a sort of long and winding road in this one, isn't there? But basically, I think that the intent of this, the government's not calling it a recycling tax, right? So the industry...
They never do call it what it is.
I know. But this is the industry getting ahead of the policy and saying, if we're forced to do this, we will have to, our arm will be twisted. We'll have to pass the costs on to consumers, which means that in effect, it will be, well, then you would just say that any cost that you impose on any industry ever is a tax, because they say, well, we have no choice but to pass it on to consumers. Having said that, putting that aside, it seems to be, the problem has been, of course, we know that we've been recycling all our stuff dutifully. I'm OCD about it. You put your bottles and your cans and your papers out, and it goes shipped off to China or Indonesia, then no one ever sees it again. No one knows what happens. No one knows if it's just set fire to. No one actually knows if it's getting recycled. And so the government is trying to put in place a better oversight regime and then recoup the cost for that through this recycling tax that it isn't. But having said all that, I think the real point is we now know why Anthony Albanese went to Anthony Pratt's party on the weekend. Because the biggest recycler by a country mile is Visy, and it's paper and cardboard recycling that wants the exemption to these measures. So you can imagine the conversations that went on while Katy Perry was singing "You're Gonna Hear Me Roar."
I don't think anyone was talking about recycling while Katy Perry was singing. But I've heard about people like this who are OCD about the recycling, and every little container and bottle top, they're separating into all the different... I can't imagine that no one has the time.
The first house, at our house now, the first week we moved in, we missed the recycling, right? And because we didn't know the days, obviously, and got mixed up. I took everything out of the recycling bin, put it in the back of the car, drove to our old house and put it in that recycling bin, because I just couldn't handle it just sitting there.
If you did your homework on where it actually goes and how much of it is actually recycled, you would lose your passion in a big hurry. I mean, so much of it is farcical.
I know, and that is
as it is. And then the idea that they're going to pass costs on to the consumer for having yellow bins that nobody asked for anyway. This was always a government initiative, and we're all for more sustainability. But when you're making these kinds of rules and regulations that everyday people who there's no opt-in or out option have to then pay for when life's expensive enough.
But the government's not making us pay for it. The industry, the government's saying, no, hang on a minute, you've been doing this on the cheap and not actually being accountable for where it ends up or checking that your supply lines as to where it actually ends up.
It's a new recycling tax.
Please.
There will be no recycling tax under the government, I read.
Now, very quickly before we go, now we're laughing, and this is actually a serious topic, but Barnaby Joyce is taking the week off the parliamentary sitting. He's now revealed that he has a sleeping issue as well.
Not on the night.
Not on that night.
Well, maybe that's why he was having a snooze on the pavement that evening.
Sleep talking.
Yeah.
No, but seriously, the Nationals leader, David Littleproud, has said that, he needs the time off because he has this sleep disorder. According to Barnaby, it's not a drinking problem, it's sleep apnea. A lot of people suffer from sleep apnea. A lot of wives or husbands struggle to sleep, seriously, when their partner has sleep apnea. So, do you think this is going to garner some more sympathy for him, Liz?
I don't know. I feel like as this story unfolds, it just becomes almost less credible. So we were told that he was on medication for something at the time, so he wasn't actually that drunk. It was a combination, a cocktail of factors. Why wouldn't you have just told us that at the time? At the time, we were told that it was kind of like taking personal medication. Now we find out it was just sleep-related. Why wouldn't you just say that? Like you say, thousands of people struggle
and
with
they're
sleep
not all
apnea.
passing out on the pavement
No,
swearing into
I
their
know
phone.
them personally, and they just sleep with an
But
apparatus
yeah, I know.
that
Oh
helps.
my God, my whole family's got
So
it. It's
it's
the most annoying thing in the world.
Yeah, lots of
again,
kids have it as well, by the way.
So I just find it makes it less credible.
The problem is, and yes, the excuses have sort of varied a bit and became, was he on medication or was he just tired because he hadn't been able to sleep because you have to keep waking up in the night? Or, again, there's not many medications where, you have it and then you have, one glass of wine and suddenly you're flat on your back on the middle of the
you
street.
still have to have drunk a lot.
But you don't have to. But again, this guy doesn't need to be crucified for this. This is the thing. Like, it is a victimless crime. Yeah, it's a bit embarrassing. He's not hurting anyone. It's not like Lydia Thorpe when she's running out abusing people or screaming at people and accusing them of all sorts of things. He's just a bloke who's had too much to drink. I reckon all of us, but for the grace of God, have been in that position, for better or worse, at some point over our lives. And
Speak for yourself, Joe.
Well, maybe I've done enough for everybody else.
You're on the desk with two responsible.
I know plenty of people. I know plenty of very
right.
respectable, lovely women who have had a little bit too much and then gone on to tut others. No one on this desk, I have to say.
Thank you.
And I've done the rest.
There you go. Joe Hildebrand, Liz Storer. We'll see you at 10 o'clock
Sharri.
tonight. Thank you both
Thanks,
so
mate.
much. Now, the tragic alleged double murder that's gripping the country. We've got a chilling update for you after the break with crime reporter Mark Morri on that failed 000 call. Plus, we'll break down the massive loss for Nikki Haley in her home state. That's coming up. All right, welcome back. Well, now to a chilling update on the alleged double murder of Jessie Baird and Luke David. Specialist police divers have been searching for their bodies in multiple dams on a property in Bungonia today. And it comes as police have revealed that a 000 call was made from Baird's phone after shots were heard on the morning the couple were allegedly murdered by police officer Beau Lamar Condon. Now, the New South Wales Police Commissioner Karen Webb is also under fire for taking 3 days to speak publicly about this. Radio host Ben Fordham criticised her and interviewed her today. Have a listen.
Lots of opportunities for her to find her stride and really make her mark, but you can see it on the text line every time her name comes up. The overwhelming feedback from people is, where's Karen Webb? Who is the New South Wales Police Commissioner? She just doesn't have the presence.
Are there questions over your leadership?
No, and that's offensive. In fact, I've already said this morning, on Friday I was in budget estimates, which is a parliamentary hearing, sworn on oath, between 9 and 5:30 in the day.
All right, joining me now, the Daily Telegraph's crime editor, Mark Morri. Moz, so great to have you on the show again. Look, so we hear about that 000 phone call that didn't connect. Is it possible, do police think that Jessie tried to get help in potentially his last moments alive?
Definitely, and there's actually a clarification now that it's possibly come from Luke's phone, but obviously it's come from one of those men feeling that they are under threat or possibly even injured. The shots were, as you said, heard 4 minutes beforehand. Now, there's still questions to be asked about what happened with that. I've heard that they can actually ping where the phone call has come from. Now, those questions are still now being asked again. And, the more we get into this story, it involves allegedly a policeman shooting 2 people, and there are questions being asked now about response to that 000 call, to the fact that that alleged killer had access to his service weapon. So, as you said, the pressure is mounting now on Karen Webb as well.
And do you think there are questions for her to answer here? I mean, not just about not fronting the media, but also whether police should be able to access their weapons without a good reason. Well, they do have. There's so many protocols, to be fair to them, that are used. And they've got to have weapons. It's especially what we've been seeing in Sydney over the last couple of years. It's a pretty violent city, and there's a lot of gangsters out there. There's a lot of guns, so they have to have that. They've got a lot of protocols around checking guns, but this one is whether he's lied to continue to have it for so much longer than he was really necessary, and while he was supposedly off, and then not
handing it in after supposedly saying he was sick. So, yeah, there are protocols, and that's why they've actually asked for an independent review of some of those protocols.
Look, Dave Hudson held a press conference today, about the ins and outs of this case. It seems like they've changed the search location for where they're hunting for the bodies. But at this point in time, we don't know that Bo is actually cooperating with police.
In fact, he isn't, from what I've been told. And I think they're trying to ask him yet again today, either later today or again tomorrow. They'll attempt to interview him. Though obviously, he's got legal representation now, but he is not cooperating. He's, to the point where he actually did go to Bondi Police Station when it became well known that he was being wanted for questioning. He has handed himself in. Police were confident enough to actually charge him with both murders. So, but now, as to where the two men are or where their bodies are, he doesn't appear to be helping them at all, or else I think we'd know where they are.
And what's this? We also learned today that he might have made a partial admission to an acquaintance, as early as the Thursday, that he was...
The Tuesday, I think, is...
The Tuesday?
Yeah.
That he was involved in the two deaths. So what happened?
Well, the police are keeping that very close to their chest, as they say, because it's evidence building for the court case. But I believe he was in contact and using... His phone was going on and off, from what I can gather. And the police, I think he's actually made some admissions that the police are going to use in their brief of evidence that he was involved in the murders. So we're going to have to wait for more of that to come out. But as every day something new is coming out, again while they're searching, I think we'll find there'll be more information tomorrow, because as you said, early on they were quite confident that the bodies may be in the dam. They've now found out that they believe the accused went back there. Whether he thought that he was worried that they'd floated back or that they hadn't sunk properly. He's gone and got weights. He's driven Bungonia up to, and then he's gone back. He's gone to Sydney to get these weights and then driven back. From the
and then there's a gap
calculations...
in the timeline, so the police think he might have tried to move the bodies somewhere else.
That's right. And then you've got to remember the van is found in Grays Point, where there's some waterways as well down there. So there's a lot of... And he's gone up to Newcastle. There's so much territory for them to cover, but they'll be retrieving data constantly to try and figure out where he's put it. And unless he actually tries to help them, it could be a long, long time before these two bodies are found and laid to rest.
That's such a terrible, terrible story. It's so sad. And Mark Morri, there's no one better at police reporting than you. You've got unrivalled police contact. So thank you so much. And we'll have you on the show again when there's major updates. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sharri.
Now, Donald Trump has celebrated yet another victory in the race to become the Republican presidential nominee. He won the South Carolina primary on Saturday. He beat Nikki Haley in her own home state. This is now a clean sweep so far for him. Have a look.
That is really something. This was a little sooner than we anticipated. It was an even bigger win than we anticipated. And I was just informed that we got double the number of votes that has ever been received in the great state of South Carolina. So that's pretty good. So it's a record times 2.
All right, Sky News contributor Kosha Garda joins me now. Kosha, look, this is quite a big loss for Nikki Haley. Not unexpected, but she's refusing to drop out of the race.
She sure is. 2 records were set yesterday, Sharri. One is what President Trump there said, the double the number of votes ever received in a presidential primary. The second record is the margin of defeat that has been taken over here by a home state candidate who has not yet suspended the campaign. So nobody else has been defeated in their home state by this margin. So that really just puts your question in, I think, a starker light. It's interesting. I'm not sure why she's not dropping out. We can only speculate. Anything from it allows her to continue, for staying in the limelight for future career prospects. It could be that she's positioning herself as the heir apparent in the event that something happens to Trump and he is not able to run or suspends his Trump's campaign or anything else even more sinister. Or it could be something else, that there's some more cynical people would say it's controlled opposition and there's a purpose over here to muddy up the path to victory for the GOP. I'm not sure where the reality is. We can only speculate, but it does seem a little bit odd because she just doesn't really have a path to victory, and it's interesting. Normally somebody would drop out by now, but she's choosing to stick with it.
She claims, and she's argued this throughout her campaign, that she's got a better chance of beating Joe Biden than Donald Trump has. Do you think the polls bear this out? Is this true?
I don't. That is definitely the cover story, if you will, that she's been saying for why she's sticking in the race. But, we've discussed this before, that some people would say notionally she's a little bit more palatable with independents or the suburban women who are in swing states and don't like Trump, have never liked him. But even if that's true, first of all, we don't know if it's true, because in a general election, how many of those people would vote for her over the Democrat, whether it's Biden or somebody else, is not proven. But secondly, even if she is stronger with them than Trump, she is very weak with Republican base. That's just the reality. 70+% of them support Trump. They think he has unfinished business. That's bearing out in election after election. And you cannot win the general as a Republican candidate without having that base. The independents are icing on the cake, but you need the cake, which is the base, and she just doesn't have that. So I don't see how she has a stronger path to victory.
I mean, now we're looking at Michigan, which is coming next, but you just also have to wonder how long those backing her, the finance, because that's ultimately part of the decision-making, isn't it? How long they're going to stick with her.
Very good point. And I think just hours ago, there was some breaking news here where the Koch brothers, who are these libertarian billionaires, I think one of them has passed, one is still there, but they back this fundraising group, which is a big hallmark in Republican fundraising. They just announced that while they support her, they're very happy that they backed her. They were backing her up until now. They've decided they will not be funding her anymore because they don't see a path to victory, even if they like her personally. So that's very interesting. I don't know if that's the first domino to fall, but that was a pretty big hit that she took on the back of this result in South Carolina.
Yeah, fascinating, that breaking news. All right, Koshigata, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now, coming up, Anthony Albanese's brutal beating in the polls. 2 polls out today, and this all just a week out from the Dunkley by-election. My Political Insiders panel will join me next. Welcome back. Well, the Prime Minister took a risk in overhauling the Stage 3 tax cuts. And unfortunately for him, according to polls out today, it doesn't look like it's worked. Labor's primary has fallen again in the latest news poll, down to 33%. That was where it was when Labor won last time. It was a record low primary for the Labor Party. And for the first time since the election, the coalition has overtaken Labor in the Herald's Resolve poll. This after border security and boats have been back in the news big time. And the timing couldn't be worse for the PM ahead of the Dunkley by-election this Saturday. Albanese is expected to win it, but if he doesn't, his leadership will be in serious trouble. Well, to discuss this, joining me now, former Chief of Staff to Bill Shorten and now current Director at GXO Strategies, Cameron Milner, and the Australian's National Affairs Editor, Joe Kelly. Welcome to you both. Look, Cameron, what do you think these 2 polls out today show about the gamble of the changes to the Stage 3 tax cuts? Or do you think they're more a reflection of the major problems on border security that Labor's had over the past couple of weeks?
Well, the numbers are terrible for Labor because it goes right back to Groundhog Day, which was the worst primary that Labor had recorded ever in terms of trying to win elections. So it's the last 18 months have been zeroed off. But it's all about, I think, the Prime Minister's broken promise. It's about the fact that the electors can't trust his word any longer. This guy went and promised a lot and broke his word to buy the Stage 3 tax cuts to win the Dunkley by-election. The Dunkley by-election is critical for Labor, and this Saturday is a crucial moment in terms of what's going to happen for the next 12 to 15 months of electoral politics. Because if Labor Party wins, if the Prime Minister wins Dunkley and shows there's no cost to lying, Dunkley will give him a licence to lie about a lot more.
Joe, what do you think about this? What do you think the news poll today says about Labor's fortunes, and what are you expecting on Saturday?
Well, look, Sharri, I'd be concerned if I was Anthony Albanese about a couple of things the polls are showing. So, firstly, I'd be aware that the polls show that there's majority support for my tax cut revamp. That's shown by the news poll a couple of weeks back and also by Resolve today. we know that about 86% of Australians will get a larger tax cut. It's about 10.8 million Australians. So despite the fact that 86% of the country that works will be left better off by the stage 3 tax revamp, Labor's position in the polls has not improved. They've got no bump. So I'd be concerned about that fact if I was Anthony Albanese. I would also be concerned if I was Anthony Albanese about the fact that if he does have a poor performance in the Dunkley by-election, if he goes on to lose, not only are there questions about his personal leadership, he did obviously mishandle the Voice referendum last year. This will be yet another blow, but he damages the entire stage 3 tax cut policy. It will be seen as a complete dud. It will be seen as an electoral bomb. Now, the stage 3 tax cuts don't come into effect until July. So there's a lot riding on this Dunkley by-election, and I think the polls show some concerning trends for Anthony Albanese.
Look, Cameron, clearly the PM is worried about things are going for him, even how his own office is running, and the advice that he's been receiving, because he's hired David Epstein, you know, Kevin Rudd's former senior advisor, also Fiona Sugden, who also once worked for Rudd, and then Catherine Murphy from The Guardian. So, you know, you've got to wonder what this means about how Albanese is trusting the advice that he's been receiving from his office to this point.
Well, we know at the end of last year when the numbers were terrible that things were tense in his office. He was losing staff all over the place. Some staff referred to him as Yelbo, not Albo. But bringing in 3 very senior political operators
That is hilarious. I haven't heard that before. You're saying his staff call him
Yelbo. Yeah.
Because he shouts.
Was what they were calling it.
Is that right?
Yes, exactly. Shrill shouting about the situation. But bringing in 3 very senior operators says to me that he wasn't trusting the advice he'd received for the last 2 years. Because you don't bring in a former Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, as some sort of advisor on the side. You bring him in for another form of advice. And David Epstein's excellent. But he'll be giving counter advice to Tim Gartrell, to Catherine Murphy, to Fiona Sugden, because that's what they've brought in terms of the number of chiefs in the room giving advice to the Prime Minister now.
I mean, we're talking about this advice. I spoke earlier in the night about this piece that Christopher Dawes just written, where it says that the Prime Minister completely ignored those advising him against having a Voice referendum, and they all seem to know it was a risky mistake, but he went ahead with it anyway. You know, Joe, but also that anecdote's kind of hilarious because Anthony Albanese seems like such a relaxed person. You know, everything I've ever seen of him, and I did have a lot to do with him when I was political editor for the Daily Telegraph in Canberra. I've never kind of heard that he has a bad temper, but yet his nickname, as Cameron Milner's just revealed, is apparently Yelbo. Joe, you know, do you hear stories that align with this?
I think there's a certain amount of pressure and exposure once you take on the top job in the country. It's a transformative role, and we see lots of cases of people who come into roles and sometimes they exceed expectations, sometimes they underperform. Being Prime Minister of the country is obviously being, you know, exposed to those forces of extreme pressure. So I think things that perhaps you wouldn't expect, anomalies of character, are exposed in those sorts of situations. But in relation to the Voice, the story that you outlined before, I think certainly on election night, Anthony Albanese wanted to make this a personal symbol of his own leadership, his own brand. And I think this was just the start of many mistakes in essentially what will be a textbook case of how to tank a referendum.
Yeah, look, the news poll today for the Oz also showed that 55% of all voters support the idea of small modular nuclear reactors. The biggest support is actually the young generation, 18 to 34-year-olds. Cameron, Labor's ruled out any changes at all. Chris Bowen, just on the weekend, he wrote a piece for the Oz saying that nuclear energy is a fairy tale. He says, like many things in the climate debate, the push for nuclear power has taken on a singular importance in the culture wars. I mean, Cameron, look, I'm not an expert on energy, but it seems bizarre for Chris Bowen to be ruling out a source of energy that many countries use across Europe because he thinks it's an ideological issue.
Well, France made up its Paris climate change agreement because it had nuclear power, rather than coal-fired generators. So look, I think people want cheaper power. They want reliable power, they want cheaper power. And quite frankly, if the solar and the wind and the batteries isn't going to work, then we should be mature enough as a country to do what the UK, the French, the Germans, the US and Japan and many other countries do and have nuclear power as part of the mix. It's a no-brainer. And the fact that 18 to 34-year-olds say it tells you that's the case.
Joe, what do you think about this? Do you think Chris Bowen has been too hasty and radical in just ruling out what could be a very sensible future source of power?
Well, I think it's completely unsurprising, Sharri. There are a number of sacred cows of Labor policy and they're opposed to nuclear power, just like they're opposed to changing the GST. So this is Labor's standard position. No one should be surprised that this is what Chris Bowen has said. But what we are seeing is we're seeing the politics of the energy debate now start to change. And what will happen going to the next election is that we know that Peter Dutton is finalising a new energy policy. We're almost certain to see a plan for the rollout of small modular reactors on the sites of coal-fired power stations. We'll get some costs. We'll get timelines. And this isn't about 2030. The technology has a longer time lag than that. This will be fed into the politics of the debate about reaching the 2050 target of net zero. So this is about a long-term change in the climate, the politics of climate change. And Chris Bowen is going to need to be able to respond to the changing politics. And simply dismissing it as a distraction or an attempt by the coalition to engage in the culture wars, I think is an inadequate response.
Yeah. Look, there's this story about, the Treasurer Jim Chalmers has been implementing reforms on the RBA. One of those reforms is changing the structure of how the Reserve Bank works. Up until this point, we kind of thought this had bipartisan support, but now it seems like Peter Dutton's gearing up to knock back Labor's changes unless the Treasurer agrees to keep the 6 current private sector members of the RBA board on the new specialist monetary policy board. Cameron, this is an area where it seemed like we hadn't heard that much opposition. But if the coalition doesn't agree, then that will leave Labor dealing with the Greens on this. And, who knows, they could be demanding more union members on the board.
Well, and the Greens have got a whole menagerie of requests they make on every piece of legislation that Labor doesn't have the coalition support for. But I think it's great that Jim Chalmers is actually reforming the RBA. He's actually got a plan to actually change the institutions around Australia for the better. And so I think, full marks to Jim. He's doing the right thing. He's reforming a great institution like the RBA, and I'm sure he'll get his legislation through without having to kowtow to the Greens and their crazy demands.
Yeah. Joe, what do you think about this? The part of the reforms that some economists have questioned is having that dual mandate for the RBA, adding employment as a mandate rather than just inflation. Do you think that could be problematic?
Well, it's probably surprising. I don't share Cameron's view on this particular issue. I think that, what we see is when there's a new Labor government, Labor is good at actually changing institutions. And this is what we've seen, not just with the RBA, but Jim Chalmers is engaged with this now with the Productivity Commission. We saw they established a national anti-corruption watchdog. They wanted to establish a new Indigenous advisory body in the Constitution. So again, in some respects, we shouldn't be surprised. This is what Labor governments tend to do. But there's been a lot of opposition and concern expressed about the changes that Jim Chalmers has proposed. And I have actually been a little surprised at the coalition position. It is certainly hardening now, but initially there was, I think, a sentiment of support for these changes. But the key issue at the moment is the membership of the new Specialist Monetary Policy Board. Will there be continuity? Will the current members of the RBA board be rolled over to the new Specialist Monetary Policy Board with their tenures intact? Now, I haven't heard a clear answer from the government on that issue yet, and my understanding is that unless the coalition receives assurances that this will be the case, that they will vote against that legislation, and then that will mean that this overhaul of the institution will be left to the passage of the Greens.
All right, all right. Joe Kelly, Cameron Milner, thank you both so much. Really fascinating conversation. After the break, Paul Morri, his pub test on the Dunkley by-election, that's coming up. All right, tomorrow night on the show, Scott Morrison's warning that we're entering a valueless void. We're going to talk about that. That's all we've got time for today. I'll see you tomorrow at 8. And here's the great Paul Morri with his pub test.